What up, Jags fans? It is mock draft time. We're just a little over 2 weeks away from day one of the NFL draft. One of the most fun days on the NFL calendar where you get to see your player get selected and you kind of get to see really what goes on around the league. Because obviously there's a lot of fun moves. There's a lot of stuff that people get surprised about. Maybe a team overdrafts a quarterback. Maybe a team trades back a bunch and gets some picks. I don't know. There's a lot of fun stuff that goes on in the NFL draft, and really with all this smoke that we hear about the pre-draft process, it finally comes into play here, and you actually get to see what happens. And most importantly, you get to see what your team does and how much better they got. So with this, Jaguars have the number 5 overall pick. They also have a second-round pick. They have 2 third-round picks and 2 fourth-round picks, each coming at toward the end of the round because the Jaguars last year were trading back from 17 to 23 with the Minnesota Vikings and picking up Brian Thomas Jr. The Jaguars were able to snag a third-round pick and a fourth-round pick in this draft. So tip your cap to Balky for helping us out a little bit there. Then a 5th-round pick, 2 6th-round picks. They got a 6th-round pick from the Travis Gibson trade when the Jaguars traded him away to the Seattle Seahawks last year, right before the regular season started. And then they also have a 7th-round pick. Jaguars have the most picks of any team in this NFL draft, as James Gladstone says, for now. And with that said, some of the needs I have for the Jaguars are interior defensive line, interior offensive line, wide receiver, safety, and running back. I think these are some positions where I think the Jaguars could really use some starting level players. Now, of course, the Jaguars can use depth all over the place. I mean, they could use cornerback depth. They could, of course, use another pretty good edge rusher to have in the mix. There's additional needs there, but with that said, these are players that I think the Jaguars need to address probably decently early. Now, maybe not interior offensive line because the Jaguars do have some set starters there, but I think that the Jaguars need to start drafting players there instead of signing players there. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this. Now, with number 5 overall pick, I am making this pick with the assumption that 2 quarterbacks are gone. Also, Abdul Carter is gone, and also Travis Hunter is gone. I want Travis Hunter. I just feel like when it's all said and done, I don't think he's going to be there. So with that said, I think the Jaguars are going to select Mason Graham, defensive tackle out of Michigan. And, there might be a toss-up here between offensive line or defensive line because there are some good offensive linemen that will be available here. But when you look at what the Jaguars did in free agency, they signed 4 offensive linemen and 0 defensive linemen. So it just doesn't feel like they're going to go into the direction of, adding another offensive lineman. So with that said, on this, there's some knocks on him mainly because of his length. I mean, there's some measurable flaws, I guess, about Mason Graham. But I think the main thing is we need to go back to who's a good football player, right? When you turn on a game, who stands out to you? And Mason Graham is pretty much a game wrecker. I mean, he pops out at games. He's just a naturally good football player. And, I think the Jaguars need that presence on the interior of the defensive line that we haven't had in so long. I mean, the Jaguars need to find this might be hyperbole, but maybe like an Aaron Donald, or even, go one step maybe back. And even if you get a Quinnen Williams, right, or a Christian Wilkins, the Jaguars need to get that type of player on the defensive line, and then they can really become a staple of the Jaguars team, and they can re-sign contracts and stuff like that. So that's why I have the Jaguars taking Mason Graham if the draft goes the way I think it's going to go. So next pick in round 2, pick number 36, I have the Jaguars drafting wide receiver from Ohio State, Emeka Egbuka. I'm not exactly sure how to say that, Egbuka. But when you look at the Jaguars in free agency lost 2 receiving threats on the interior of the, that come out of the slot or the interior of the offense with Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram. That's a lot of targets, and the Jaguars only added De'Ami Brown. So there's clearly a pretty big need at wide receiver, and especially on the interior, because last year I felt like the Jaguars were pretty rich here, with having Christian Kirk, having Evan Ingram, and having Parker Washington. But with all that out of there, you only really have Parker Washington, and we got to see what Britton Strange can develop into. But with that said, I think he is an instant starter in the slot. He's explosive. He's a good route runner. And, I think one of these refined players, and especially coming out of a school like Ohio State, I feel you can never go wrong with drafting wide receivers from LSU or Ohio State. So with that said, I think he becomes an instant playmaker and he has instant success for the Jaguars at wide receiver in the slot. So that is my pick in round 2. Now, round 3, at pick number 70 overall, I have the Jaguars drafting Tate Ratledge, offensive guard out of Georgia. Now, the Jaguars, of course, signed center Robert Hainsey and also guard Patrick McCarry. But kind of like I was saying earlier, the Jaguars haven't drafted a true building block interior offensive lineman since Brandon Leonard in 2014. So that's like a third of our franchise ago. I mean, the Jaguars are going on, 31 years of football, and I think they signed him in the Jaguars' 20th year. So, like, too much time has gone by. It's time to start actually drafting these guys instead of going out there and paying money for mediocre offensive linemen or overpaying for offensive linemen at guards that maybe shouldn't get that much money. So, with that said, Tate is a powerful and mean football player. I think he brings that nasty edge for the Jaguars that could really be what the Jaguars are looking for. Now, the cool thing about this is that he doesn't need to be an instant starter. He can back up any of these guys, whether you want to be kind of the player in waiting for Ezra Cleveland at left guard or Patrick McCarry at right guard. I think he can kind of slot in as a backup, or, these guys get injured all the time. He could be the first guy off the bench in case of an injury, because how often do you have all 5 offensive linemen healthy the whole entire year? It doesn't really happen. So, with that said, I have Tate Ratledge out of Georgia at round number 30. Now, additional pick on round 3, which, by the way, round 2, day 2 of the NFL draft is going to be really fun. As it stands right now, 3 different picks. So we're going to come away with hopefully some good football players. So in round 3, at pick number 88, via the Vikings, of course, the Jaguars, I have drafting safety Andrew Mukubu out of Texas. Now, he's a 4-year starter. He's a guy that is really good in coverage, and he's a guy that excels in zone coverage, which, when you look at the trends of what Green Bay's defense was last year, they were one of the teams that ran zone defense the most. And the reason why I, of course, mention the Green Bay Packers is that the Jaguars have Anthony Campanile as the defensive coordinator who comes over from Green Bay. So I imagine, a lot of times when guys come from these teams, they kind of bring over similar variations of that defense that they learned from. So with that, he could definitely see he sees routes really well when it comes to developing, and that's what's kind of good about being a zone player. And I think that he could potentially be a starter, maybe not week 1, but right now the Jaguars, it's a little bit fuzzy what's going on at safety, right? You sign Eric Murray from the Texans, who's like 31 years old, right? You have Antonio Johnson, who disappointed last year. Now, I tend to give some like leeway to these defensive backs because every single defensive back on the Jaguars regressed in 2024. And I don't think every player got worse. I think that they were just in a terrible, terrible scheme. Well, Antonio Johnson, for one reason or another, did not play well last year. They gave a bunch of money to Darnell Savage. There's this. I'm not comfortable with any one safety on the Jaguars right now. So let's go young. Let's draft a guy. Let's kind of have a guy that could come in here and all of a sudden, boom, you have a starter for the foreseeable future. So with that said, I have Andrew Mukubu from Texas. Now, in round 4, we're going to stick with the new SEC team, the Texas Longhorns. We're going to draft the tight end Gunnar Helm. So, with that said, the Jaguars, I think, have a tight end 1 in Britton Strange. I do really believe in Britton Strange. I think we saw a lot of good things out of him last year. And I think going forward, when you allow him to have another year in the Jaguar system and another year where he is now going to be the feature guy, I think he's going to really excel in that role. And when you look outside of that, the Jaguars, of course, cut Evan Ingram. They let walk Luke Farrell. So right now you kind of signed 2 Band-Aids and Hunter Long and Johnny Munt to 1- and 2-year deals. These guys are just guys to raise the floor of the ecosystem of the offense by being nothing more than who they are, right? But the Jaguars, I think, with Gunnar Helm, I think he's the kind of prototype that the Jaguars want. A big body, can do both when it comes to like run blocking and pass catching. So, of course, he does need a good amount of development, but That's typically what tight ends do, man. Tight ends need a decent amount of development. They rarely come in here in year one unless they're a freak like Brock Bowers or whatever. They rarely come in year one and really excel. So with that said, he's another guy that doesn't need to start with like day one, but I think he's going to be a good developmental guy, and I think he could develop into a good tight end too for the Jaguars, and they can kind of have their good two tight end sets, especially when you look at toward 2026. Now next up, round 4, pick number 126 via the Minnesota Vikings. I had the Jaguars selecting Kobe Bryant, cornerback out of Kansas. Now, Kobe Bryant, very instinctual cornerback. He has, I think, the knock on him is just the lower than average athleticism. But I think with this, you have a guy that just has a really high passion for the game of football. And he's also another guy that is best used in his own defense. So I think if you can bring in a guy that and find a role for him, especially a player like this that, he's maybe a little bit hindered on the athleticism side of things, but, has high upside when it comes to just knowing where to be. Is smart football player, has high football IQ. I think that's the type of player that the Jaguars could sign that could really excel here. So with that said, Kobe Bryant, quarterback out of Kansas at pick number 126. Now, in round 5, pick number 142, I have RJ Harvey, running back out of UCF. Now, this is probably a homer pick for me because I absolutely loved RJ Harvey, and just watching him for UCF, I don't think the UCF would have won a single game in the Big 12 if it wasn't for RJ Harvey. He was the entire UCF offense. He's just got insane physicality. Now, right now, he's probably not a third down back just because he kind of struggles when it comes to picking up blitzes, but with his low center of gravity at 5'8", 205, I think he could potentially develop into that. And I almost wonder because I think he goes kind of late in mock drafts, and a lot of people use him as I like this guy more than other guys. Like, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if this guy somehow snuck into day 2 of the draft, just because I think that he's very easy to fall in love with. I think that a lot of times there's players that teams like more than scouts or more than the media. And I think this could potentially be one of those guys. But, with the Jaguars just in 2024, when they needed to get a yard, they couldn't get a yard, right? And that's was so frustrating. I mean, I don't want to relive 2024 because honestly, it was one of the worst years as a Jags fan. Just when you have all these expectations and they just don't get met, and then you have the mess that was the Jaguars with just leadership not being there. And, the Jaguars, of course, suffered a lot of injuries, and we had all these expectations. Wasn't fun, but most of all, the run game just wasn't good. And the Jaguars Liam Cohen needs to have the same impact for the Jaguars that he had for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the run game. Man, could you imagine the Jaguars offense if they were somehow in the top 10 rushing attack? You combine that with Trevor Lawrence hopefully taking his step forward. You have Brian Thomas Jr., wide receiver 1. You have Britton Strange develop into a good tight end. And then all of a sudden, maybe you draft this guy on day 2 of the NFL draft, and all of a sudden, boom. I think that opens up the pass game a lot, because I think there's been as much criticism as Trevor Lawrence gets, which a lot of it is probably rightfully so. You haven't really been able to give him a good run game. And when all pressure and all eyes are on Trevor Lawrence, he hasn't been able to succeed like that way. And I think it'd be good to finally bring in a run game. And with having a physical running back like RJ Harvey, I think this would be really good for the Jaguars. Now, next up, round 6, pick number 182. I had the Jaguars selecting Tyleik Williams, defensive tackle out of Ohio State. I think, is it Williams? I'll have to check. Defensive tackle out of Ohio State. Now, he's a run defender with a big body. And last year, the Jaguars just couldn't stop the run, right? And the Jaguars, of course, talk about addressing, they need to build the trenches, right? Well, on the offensive line, you did a lot. You added 4 offensive linemen. Defensive linemen, you didn't really add much. Well, in this mock draft, we have Mason Graham getting selected. Now you have another defensive tackle getting selected here. And he's just a big body guy that kind of has the physical ability, but now you just kind of need to work on his technique, get his hands situated right, and, kind of work with him on that. And then hopefully he can be good for you. But, we're kind of getting into round 6 territory. This is where you're kind of selecting a lot of hopefully high upside players. Get the guy that ran the fastest 40, get the guy that did all these bench press reps, right? Kind of go after these guys. So Next pick, pick number 194 via the Seattle Seahawks. I had the Jaguars selecting Fadil Diggs, edge rusher out of Syracuse. This is someone that I would probably call a bulky player. You know, he's a big body. He has the NFL size and length. He just needs to raise his football IQ because sometimes he gets a little bit, lost on the field with knowing where he needs to be. But heck, the Jaguars used a first-round pick on Taven Bryan, and he never knew where he needed to be. So throwing a 6th-round pick at that, I wouldn't mind. So with that said, like I said, he has the type of measurables that's needed, but he just needs to raise a football IQ. So next up, the last pick, round 7, pick number 221 out of the Jaguars selecting Caden Prater, wide receiver out of Maryland. Now, he's a guy that I get intrigued by just because of the big body, 6'3", 204 pounds, an outside target for the Jaguars. Right now the Jaguars' true outside targets are, Brian Thomas Jr. and De'Ami Brown and Gabe Davis. So hopefully Gabe Davis has a renaissance. I do believe in him a lot more than many people do because I don't say this on Twitter because I don't want people to take it the wrong way, but I know people who know Gabe Davis, and Gabe Davis was pissed at the Jaguars because he got injured and they never let him get back to being healthy, right? They put him back out there. He was never healthy, and then he re-injured himself and he was out for the year, right? So I think I do see a renaissance for Gabe Davis to not necessarily be a 1,000-yard receiver, but be a role player for the Jaguars, right? So I have another guy with kind of similar measurables. He is an outside threat, another kind of deep option for the Jaguars. And, hopefully the Jaguars get a run game. They can take the top off of defense. But, maybe Caden Prater is more of maybe a preseason guy a lot of people get excited about, but ultimately ends up being a practice squad player. So with that said, that is my mock draft. Appreciate you guys for being patient with me. I know I've been a little bit absent here on YouTube, but I'm just trying to raise a 1-month-old baby right now. So, but everything's going good. Can't wait for the draft. I'll, of course, be live probably the first 2 nights. Lots of content definitely to come for the NFL draft. And with all that said, thank you guys for sticking with me. Please do me a favor. Drop a like on this video on your way out, and go Jags.